Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds almost impossible to modern ears. Ancient civilizations that built massive infrastructure, watched it get destroyed by floods every single year, and then simply rebuilt it. No insurance companies, no emergency funds, no government bailouts. Just thousands of people showing up with mud and straw, ready to do it all over again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine living in a world where every spring, the river nearest your home swells with such force that it erases entire neighbourhoods. Walls crumble, irrigation channels vanish beneath churning brown water, fields that took months to prepare disappear under layers of silt. Your carefully constructed home, the one you plastered with your own hands just last year, collapses into soggy rubble. And yet, when the waters recede, you don't pack up and leave. You don't file a claim or call a contractor. You simply roll up your sleeves, gather your neighbours, and start rebuilding. Because that's what your parents did. That's what their parents did. That's what everyone has always done. This is not a story of primitive people making the best of bad circumstances. This is a story of sophisticated societies that understood something we've largely forgotten. That rebuilding together was not just easier than replacing infrastructure. It was the foundation of civilization itself. It was how communities stayed bonded, how knowledge passed from generation to generation, and how entire cultures survived for thousands of years in environments that should have been uninhabitable. Today, when a flood destroys a bridge, we call in engineers, file environmental impact studies, secure funding, hire contractors, and maybe, if we're lucky, see reconstruction begin within a year. In ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and along the Yellow River, floods were not disasters. They were the calendar. They were expected, planned for, even welcomed in some ways. And the response to them was not bureaucratic. It was communal, immediate, and surprisingly efficient. So tonight, we're diving into the world of seasonal flooding, ancient maintenance systems, and the communal labour traditions that made rebuilding not just possible, but routine. We'll explore why these societies chose to rebuild rather than relocate, how they organised thousands of workers without modern tools or communication, and what their approach to infrastructure reveals about resilience, community, and the true cost of progress. Let's start with the most important question. Why did ancient peoples even settle in flood-prone areas? It seems counterintuitive, almost masochistic. Why build your entire civilization on a riverbank that routinely drowns everything you own? The answer is deceptively simple. Fertility. Rivers didn't just bring destruction, they brought life. When the Nile flooded each year, it deposited a thick layer of nutrient-rich silt across the floodplains. This natural fertilizer transformed barren desert into some of the most productive farmland on Earth. Without the flood, there was no harvest. Without the harvest, there was no Egypt. The same principle applied in Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved a green corridor through an otherwise hostile landscape. Seasonal floods replenished the soil, washed away accumulated salts, and created the agricultural surplus that allowed cities to exist. The Indus Valley civilization thrived along rivers that behaved with similar seasonal rhythms, and in China, the Yellow River earned its nickname, China's Sorrow, not because people hated it, but because they loved it enough to endure its fury. These were not accidental settlements. They were calculated risks made by people who understood that the benefits of living near water far outweighed the costs. But understanding the risk and surviving it were two different things. And survival required something modern societies often lack, a collective willingness to rebuild, again and again and again. Before we dive into how ancient peoples rebuilt their infrastructure, we need to understand what that infrastructure actually was. Because when we hear the word infrastructure today, we picture steel, concrete, asphalt, things designed to last decades with minimal maintenance. Ancient infrastructure was fundamentally different. It was made from earth, reeds, mud bricks, wood, and stone when available. These materials were abundant, easy to work with, and critically, easy to replace. Let's start with the most essential piece of ancient infrastructure: irrigation canals. These were the arteries of civilization. Without them, crops withered, cities starved, and empires collapsed. In Mesopotamia, networks of canals stretched for hundreds of miles, channeling river water into fields that would otherwise have been dust. These canals were not simple ditches. They were engineered systems with calculated gradients, sluice gates, and distribution channels that required constant oversight. But here's the thing: they were made of dirt, just compacted earth shaped into channels. When the annual floods came roaring through, they didn't gently refresh the canals, they obliterated them. Entire sections would be scoured away, filled with sediment, or rerouted by the sheer force of water. A canal that took weeks to dig could be destroyed in a single afternoon. And yet, every year, communities rebuilt them. Not because they had no other choice, though that was partly true, but because rebuilding was woven into the social and economic fabric of their society. It was expected. It was normal. It was, in a very real sense, the price of living. Then there were the homes themselves. In ancient Egypt, most people lived in mud brick houses. These weren't the sun-dried adobe bricks we might romanticize. They were simple mixtures of Nile mud and straw, shaped by hand, and left to dry under the brutal sun. They were surprisingly durable in dry conditions, but when the flood came, they softened, sagged, and eventually dissolved back into the earth from which they came. Imagine watching your home melt. Not burn, not collapse in a dramatic crash, but slowly, sadly return to mud. And then imagine turning to your neighbour and saying, well, let's build it again. Because that's what they did. Every single year in the worst hit areas. The same principles applied to walls, granaries, and even early temples. Stone was reserved for the most sacred or strategically important structures. Everything else was earth-based, organic, impermanent by design. This wasn't poor planning, it was intelligent adaptation. Why waste resources on materials that would require specialised labour and immense effort to replace when you could use materials everyone knew how to work with? In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro featured remarkably advanced drainage systems, public baths, and grid-planned streets. Yet even these sophisticated urban centres relied on baked brick, which, while more durable than mud brick, still required constant maintenance and periodic replacement. Seasonal rains and occasional river shifts meant that sections of the city were always under repair. Ancient peoples didn't see this as a flaw, they saw it as rhythm. Maintenance wasn't an interruption of normal life, it was normal life. The calendar was divided not just by seasons, but by construction phases: planting, growing, harvesting, and rebuilding. Each had its time, its rituals, and its communal expectations. And this brings us to one of the most important concepts in understanding ancient infrastructure. These societies didn't separate building from living. Construction was not something done by specialists while everyone else waited. It was participatory, it was communal, and it was deeply, profoundly social. Now let's talk about the floods themselves, because if you're going to understand why rebuilding was easier than replacing, you need to understand what these annual floods actually looked like. We're not talking about surprise catastrophes. We're talking about predictable seasonal events that ancient peoples tracked with the precision of astronomers. In Egypt, the Nile flood, known as the inundation, arrived like clockwork every summer. Farmers watched the skies for the heliacal rising of Sirius, the dog star, which signalled that the flood was imminent. Within days, the river would begin to swell, fed by monsoon rains falling thousands of miles away in the Ethiopian highlands. The water rose slowly at first, then faster, until vast stretches of the Nile Valley transformed into a shallow inland sea. This wasn't chaos, it was order. Egyptian priests kept meticulous records of flood levels using nilometers, stone structures marked with measurements that allowed them to predict the size and impact of each year's inundation. A good flood, not too high, not too low, meant abundant harvests and prosperity. A weak flood meant famine. An excessive flood meant destruction. But even excessive floods were manageable, because they followed a pattern. The water rose, peaked, and then slowly receded, leaving behind the gift of silt. Communities knew exactly how long they had to evacuate, where to move livestock, and which structures would survive versus which would need rebuilding. This predictability was everything. In Mesopotamia, the situation was more complicated. The Tigris and Euphrates were less predictable than the Nile. They flooded in spring, fed by snowmelt from the mountains of Anatolia, and their timing could vary by weeks. Worse, their floods were more violent, more erratic, and more destructive. The flat Mesopotamian plain offered little resistance to spreading water, and entire regions could be submerged with alarming speed. This unpredictability forced Mesopotamian societies to develop more sophisticated monitoring systems. Watchers were posted along the rivers to send warnings downstream. Signal fires, runners, and later, written messages carried flood alerts to cities and villages in the floodplain. Communities had emergency plans, elevated granaries, and designated refugee zones. But even with all this preparation, damage was inevitable. Dikes burst, canals overflowed, fields turned into lakes, and when the waters finally retreated, the landscape was transformed. New sandbars appeared, old channels vanished. The river might have carved an entirely new path, rendering last year's irrigation system useless. Yet, and this is critical, the flood also brought benefits. It flushed out accumulated salts from the soil, a constant problem in irrigated agriculture. It deposited fresh silt, renewing fertility, and it refilled wells, cisterns and reservoirs that would sustain communities through the dry months. So ancient peoples didn't view floods purely as disasters. They were disruptions, yes, but also renewals. The challenge wasn't to stop the floods. That was impossible with ancient technology. The challenge was to survive them, adapt to them, and rebuild quickly enough to take advantage of the fertile post-flood period. This mindset, this acceptance of natural cycles and focus on rapid recovery, is the key to understanding why rebuilding was not just feasible, but essential. Fighting the river was futile. Working with it, anticipating it, and recovering from it, that was civilization. So the flood has come and gone. The water has receded, leaving behind a muddy, transformed landscape. Homes are damaged or destroyed. Canals are filled with silt or washed away entirely. Walls have collapsed. Granaries are granaries, compromised. The infrastructure that took months to build is now rubble and mud. Now what? In a modern society, this is where bureaucracy kicks in. Damage assessments, insurance claims, contractor bids, environmental reviews, permits, funding debates. Months, sometimes years, pass before reconstruction begins. But in ancient societies there was no pause. Rebuilding began immediately, and it began with everyone. This is where communal labour enters the story, because the secret to rapid reconstruction wasn't advanced technology or unlimited resources, it was people. Lots and lots of people working together, following systems refined over generations. In ancient Egypt, this communal labour system was called the corvée. Every able-bodied person owed a certain amount of labour to the state each year. During the inundation, when fields were underwater and farming was impossible, this labour was redirected toward public works, rebuilding flood-damaged infrastructure, maintaining temples, constructing new irrigation channels, repairing roads and dikes. Thousands of workers descended on damaged areas, organised into teams under the supervision of scribes and foremen. These weren't slaves, despite what Hollywood might suggest. They were ordinary citizens fulfilling a civic obligation. In return, they received food rations, beer, and often a sense of communal pride. Inscriptions from the period describe workers boasting about their contributions, competing to see which team could move the most earth or lay the most bricks. In Mesopotamia, similar systems existed. The Akkadian term for communal labour was ilku, a form of service owed to the temple or palace. After floods, local governors, known as NC, mobilised these labour forces to restore canals, rebuild walls and repair storage facilities. The work was hard, exhausting, and often done under the brutal Mesopotamian sun, but it was also deeply social. Archaeological evidence shows that workers were provided with communal meals, often cooked in large pots and served in designated rest areas. Shared food, shared labour, shared purpose. These weren't just construction projects, they were community-building exercises, quite literally. In the Indus Valley, evidence of communal labour is less explicit because we haven't deciphered their writing system. But the sheer scale and uniformity of their urban planning suggests a highly organised society capable of mobilising large workforces. the maintenance of their drainage systems, public baths, and grid-planned streets would have required coordinated effort, especially after seasonal rains. Along the Yellow River in ancient China, similar systems emerged. The concept of collective responsibility for water management was so deeply ingrained that it became a cornerstone of Chinese statecraft. Flood control and canal maintenance were seen as the emperor's sacred duty, and failure to manage water was considered grounds for losing the mandate of heaven. But here's what makes all of these systems remarkable. They worked not because they were enforced by brutal authority, though coercion certainly existed in some cases, but because they made practical sense. Everyone benefited from functional infrastructure. Everyone suffered when it failed. And everyone understood that their individual survival was tied to collective action. This wasn't altruism. It was enlightened self-interest encoded into culture, religion, and law. Now, let's talk logistics. Because mobilizing thousands of people to rebuild infrastructure after a flood sounds chaotic. How did they coordinate? How did they know who did what? How did they prevent duplication of effort or, worse, crucial tasks being left undone? The answer is sophistication. Ancient societies developed remarkably complex administrative systems to manage communal labour, and much of this management was done without modern communication technology. No phones, no radios, no internet. Just runners, written records, and an intricate understanding of social organisation. In Egypt, scribes were the backbone of this system. They kept detailed records of which villages owed how much labour, who had fulfilled their obligations, and who had not. These records were inscribed on papyrus and stored in temple archives. When the flood receded and rebuilding began, scribes consulted these records to determine labour allocations. Workers were divided into teams, often based on their home villages. Each team had a foreman responsible for organising tasks and reporting progress back to higher officials. Larger projects were broken into manageable sections. One team might rebuild a section of canal, another might repair a dike, a third might reconstruct granary walls. The genius of this system was its modularity. Instead of trying to coordinate one massive chaotic workforce, administrators created small, self-contained units that could work semi-independently. As long as each unit completed its assigned section, the overall project progressed smoothly. Communication happened through a combination of written messages and messengers. A foreman might send a runner to the regional administrator with a report. Section 12 of the canal is complete, awaiting inspection. The administrator would dispatch an inspector, verify the work, and then reassign that team to the next task. This required literacy, but not universal literacy. As long as a small percentage of the population could read and write, the system functioned. Scribes formed a specialised class whose entire purpose was to keep the administrative machinery running. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets served the same function as Egyptian papyrus. Thousands of these tablets have been excavated, many of them boring bureaucratic records of labour assignments, ration distributions and project completions. But boring is beautiful when you're trying to manage a civilization. These tablets reveal astonishing detail. We know, for example, that workers received specific daily rations of barley, oil, and occasionally meat or fish. We know that certain tasks were considered more difficult and earned higher rations. We know that workers who failed to show up face penalties, but also that legitimate excuses, illness, family emergencies, were recorded and accepted. What emerges from these dusty administrative records is a picture of societies that took labour management seriously. They understood that keeping people fed, organised, and motivated was essential to getting infrastructure rebuilt quickly. But logistics wasn't just about administration, it was also about materials. And this is where the choice of building materials becomes crucial. Because here's the thing, if your infrastructure is made from locally available materials, mud, reeds, wood, straw, then rebuilding doesn't require complex supply chains. You don't need to import materials from distant quarries or wait for specialised shipments. You just need people and earth. After a flood, the very thing that destroyed your infrastructure also provided the means to rebuild it. The floodwaters left behind fresh deposits of mud, perfect for making bricks. Reeds grew abundantly along riverbanks, ready to be harvested for roofing and reinforcement. Wood could be gathered from nearby groves, and straw, a byproduct of the harvest, was always available. This meant that rebuilding could begin almost immediately. There was no waiting period, no logistical bottleneck. As soon as the water receded and the ground was firm enough to work on, reconstruction commenced. Compare this to modern infrastructure. When a concrete bridge collapses, you can't just scoop up some local dirt and rebuild it. You need engineers, specialised materials, heavy machinery, environmental clearances, funding. The complexity of modern infrastructure, its durability and sophistication, comes with a hidden cost: replaceability. Ancient peoples understood this trade-off instinctively. They chose materials that were easy to replace precisely because replacement was inevitable. And this choice, often dismissed as primitive, was actually deeply intelligent. Let's dig deeper into the materials themselves, because the ingenuity of ancient construction methods is often underestimated. We look at mud bricks and think, how crude. But mud brick construction is a sophisticated technology developed over millennia, refined through countless cycles of building, testing, failing, and rebuilding. A mud brick is not just mud. It's a carefully calibrated mixture of clay, silt, sand, and organic material, usually straw or chaff. The proportions matter. Too much clay and the brick cracks as it dries. Too much sand and it crumbles. Too much organic matter and it weakens. Get the balance right, and you create a building material that's strong, insulating, and remarkably durable in the right conditions. Ancient brick makers didn't have chemical analysis or engineering degrees. They had experience. Generations of knowledge passed down from parent to child, from master to apprentice. They knew by feel when the mud was the right consistency. They knew by sight when a brick had dried properly. They knew by intuition which mixtures worked best for walls versus floors versus roofs. This knowledge was community property. Everyone knew how to make a basic brick. But the best brick makers, those whose walls stood a little straighter, whose structures weathered storms a little better, they were respected, sought after, and their techniques became local legend. When rebuilding after a flood, this distributed knowledge was invaluable. You didn't need to hire specialists from distant cities. The expertise was right there, embedded in the community. Elders taught younger workers. Experienced builders guided novices, and within days, thousands of bricks were being formed, dried, and stacked into new structures. The drying process was crucial. Freshly made mud bricks are soft, vulnerable. They need time to cure in the sun, hardening into something solid. But here's where ancient peoples demonstrated remarkable patience and planning. They made more bricks than they immediately needed, creating stockpiles that could be used when urgency demanded. Some societies, particularly in Mesopotamia, also fired their bricks in kilns, creating a harder, more water-resistant material. But fired bricks required fuel, labour and time. They were reserved for important structures, temples, palaces, defensive walls. For ordinary homes and irrigation channels, sun-dried mud bricks were sufficient. Reed construction was equally sophisticated. In southern Mesopotamia, where stone and wood were scarce, reeds became a primary building material. The marshes produced vast quantities of thick, sturdy reeds that could be bundled, bent and woven into remarkably strong structures. The mudif, a traditional reed house still built by marsh Arabs in Iraq today, uses techniques unchanged for thousands of years. Bundles of reeds are planted upright in the ground, then bent and lashed together to form arches. More reeds are woven horizontally across these arches, creating walls and roofs. The result is a structure that's flexible, breathable, and surprisingly resilient. When floods damaged reed structures, repairs were straightforward. Replace the damaged bundles, reweave the affected sections, and reinforce where necessary. No specialised tools required, just sharp knives and skilled hands. This adaptability was key. Materials that could be worked with simple tools and repaired by non-specialists made rebuilding a community activity rather than an expert-dependent ordeal. Now let's talk about something modern societies struggle with, but ancient peoples seem to understand intuitively: the social benefits of collective labour. When we think about rebuilding infrastructure today, we think about efficiency, speed, cost. We want the job done quickly, by professionals, so we can get back to normal life. But ancient peoples didn't separate rebuilding from normal life. Rebuilding was normal life, and this had profound social effects. First, it reinforced community bonds. When you've spent weeks working alongside your neighbours, Hauling mud, shaping bricks, digging canals. You develop relationships that don't exist in more individualistic societies. You know who works hard. You know who complains too much. You know who brings humour to exhausting labour. You know who watches out for others. These bonds mattered. In times of crisis, illness, family emergency, these were the people who would help you, not because of formal obligation, but because of the informal ties forged through shared experience. Second, communal labour was a great equaliser. Yes, ancient societies were hierarchical. Scribes, priests and nobles didn't spend their days hauling bricks. But during large-scale reconstruction efforts, class distinctions softened. The farmer worked beside the craftsman, the merchant beside the labourer. Everyone was united by a common goal. This wasn't some utopian fantasy. Conflicts still arose. Some people shirked, some hoarded resources, but the structure of communal labour created opportunities for social cohesion that modern societies often lack. Third, and perhaps most importantly, communal rebuilding transmitted knowledge across generations. When a young person worked alongside elders, they learned not just technical skills, but values. They learned that infrastructure is precious, that it must be maintained, that everyone has a role in its preservation. This knowledge transmission happened organically, embedded in the work itself. No formal schools required, no textbooks, just hands in the mud side by side year after year. There's a term anthropologists use to describe this kind of activity: social glue, the thing that holds communities together. Ancient communal labour was social glue made visible, tangible, essential. And this, more than any engineering brilliance, is why rebuilding was easier than replacing. Because replacing implied bringing in outsiders, relying on specialists fragmenting the community. Rebuilding meant doing it together, reinforcing the very social structures that made civilization possible. But we also need to address a question that's probably nagging at you. If rebuilding was so easy, so communal, so efficient, why did these civilizations eventually decline? Why didn't they last forever? The answer is complex, but part of it comes down to what happens when rebuilding stops being sustainable. Because here's the dark side of the annual rebuilding cycle. It worked beautifully as long as the population remained stable, the environment remained predictable, and the social systems remained intact. But when any of those variables changed, the whole system could unravel. In Mesopotamia, one of the great killers of civilizations was salinization. Irrigation, even when carefully managed, gradually increased salt levels in the soil. Over centuries, fields that once produced abundant harvests became sterile white crusts. No amount of flooding could wash away the accumulated salt. As agricultural productivity declined, cities could no longer support large populations. Workers left for more fertile regions. The labour force available for maintaining and rebuilding infrastructure shrank. Canals fell into disrepair. Dikes breached and weren't fixed. The entire system entered a death spiral. Environmental change also played a role. Rivers shifted course, sometimes dramatically. A city built along a riverbank might suddenly find itself miles from water. Rebuilding irrigation infrastructure across that distance wasn't just difficult, it was impossible with ancient technology. Climate shifts, droughts, or unusually severe floods could overwhelm even the most resilient systems. If the flood was so catastrophic that it wiped out not just infrastructure but the community itself, there was no one left to rebuild. Political instability was another factor. Communal labour systems required strong, organised leadership. When central authority collapsed, whether through invasion, internal conflict, or succession crises, the administrative machinery that coordinated rebuilding broke down. Without scribes to track labour obligations, without foremen to organise teams, without ration systems to feed workers, reconstruction became chaotic, incomplete, or didn't happen at all. And here's where we see the fundamental vulnerability of these systems. They depended on social capital, on the belief that everyone would do their part, on trust that leadership was competent and fair. When that trust eroded, the entire edifice could collapse remarkably quickly. In Egypt, the collapse of the Old Kingdom after the Sixth Dynasty was partly driven by the breakdown of centralised authority. Regional governors stopped sending labour and resources to the capital. Infrastructure maintenance became localised, fragmented, less effective. It took centuries for Egypt to fully recover. So while rebuilding was easier than replacing in stable conditions, it was catastrophically difficult when those conditions changed. The very flexibility that made these systems resilient also made them vulnerable. But before we get too pessimistic, let's also acknowledge what these societies accomplished. Some of them lasted for thousands of years. The Egyptian civilization, in various forms, endured for over 3 millennia. Mesopotamian city-states rose, fell, and rose again across 2,000 years. The Indus Valley civilization thrived for nearly a millennium. These weren't primitive peoples barely scraping by. They built cities, developed writing, created art, studied astronomy, and laid the foundations for much of what we consider civilization. And they did it all while rebuilding their infrastructure every single year. That's not failure, that's extraordinary success. Now let's talk about something that might seem tangential, but is actually central to this story: the role of religion in motivating and organising communal labour. Because while we've discussed practical incentives, food rations, civic obligation, social bonds, there was another layer that made people willing to show up year after year and rebuild. They believed it was sacred. In Egypt, the Nile flood was not just a natural phenomenon, it was the tears of Isis mourning her husband Osiris. It was the life-giving essence of Hapi, the god of the inundation. Maintaining the infrastructure that managed this divine gift was not just practical, it was a religious duty. Priests officiated at ceremonies marking the beginning of reconstruction. They blessed the first bricks, consecrated the restored canals, and offered prayers for successful harvests. Workers believed that their labour pleased the gods, that it ensured cosmic order, that it was part of the great cycle of death and rebirth that governed all existence. This belief transformed exhausting labour into worship. You weren't just digging a ditch, you were participating in the sacred renewal of the world. In Mesopotamia, similar beliefs prevailed. Temples were not just religious centres, they were economic hubs that organised irrigation, managed grain storage and coordinated labour. The gods owned the land. Humans were merely stewards. Maintaining infrastructure was serving the divine landlords. Cuneiform tablets record offerings made before major construction projects. Animals sacrificed, libations poured, prayers recited. Workers believed that the gods watched their efforts, rewarded diligence, and punished laziness. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a psychological framework that made unbearable labour bearable. If you believe your work has cosmic significance, you can endure hardships that would break someone labouring without meaning. Even in more secular terms, religion provided the social infrastructure that made communal labour possible. Temples housed the scribes who managed labour roles. Temple granaries stored the grain that fed workers. Temple festivals marked the transitions between planting, flooding, and rebuilding. Religion didn't just motivate labour, it organised it. And this raises an interesting question for modern societies. What do we believe that makes us willing to sacrifice for collective good? What story do we tell ourselves that transforms individual effort into shared purpose? For ancient peoples, the answer was clear. The gods demanded it. The cosmos required it. Civilization depended on it. For us, the answers are less clear, more fragmented, and perhaps that's why rebuilding communal infrastructure feels so much harder today, even with vastly superior technology. Let's shift gears and talk about scale, because one thing that's easy to underestimate is just how much labour ancient peoples could mobilise when necessary. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the most famous monument of ancient Egypt, required an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing several tons. Modern estimates suggest it took about 20,000 to 30,000 workers, roughly 20 years to complete. But here's what's remarkable. The pyramid wasn't built by slaves, as popular myth suggests, but by rotating teams of labourers, many of whom were farmers fulfilling their corvée obligations during the flood season. Think about that. Ancient Egypt could mobilise tens of thousands of workers, house them, feed them, organise them, and sustain that effort for decades. All without computers, without modern logistics, without any of the tools we consider essential for large-scale projects. If they could build a pyramid, rebuilding flood-damaged canals was almost trivial by comparison. In Mesopotamia, similar large-scale projects demonstrated the organisational capacity of these societies. The walls of Babylon, the ziggurats, the extensive canal networks all required massive labour mobilisation. And these weren't one-time events. They were repeated, refined, and expanded over centuries. Each generation learned from the previous one, making the process more efficient, more sophisticated. This capacity for large-scale coordination is what made annual rebuilding feasible. Yes, it was hard work. Yes, it required enormous effort. But these societies had proven repeatedly that they could organise that effort effectively. Modern societies, for all our technological advantages, often struggle to coordinate large groups toward a common goal. We're fragmented, individualistic, sceptical of authority. Ancient peoples, for better or worse, had social structures that could mobilise collective action with remarkable efficiency. This doesn't mean we should romanticise ancient authoritarianism. Coercion, inequality, and suffering were real. But it does mean we should recognise that these societies possessed organisational skills we've partially lost. Now, let's address a modern question. Could we, today, adopt anything from these ancient rebuilding systems? At first glance, the answer seems like no. We can't go back to mud bricks and manual labour. We have building codes, safety regulations, environmental protections. We've specialised our economy to the point where most people lack basic construction skills. And yet, there are elements worth considering. First, the principle of designing for replaceability rather than just durability. Modern infrastructure is often built to last 50, 100, even 200 years, but when it fails, replacement is catastrophically expensive and disruptive. What if we designed some infrastructure with shorter lifespans but easier replacement in mind? Modular components that could be swapped out, materials that degrade gracefully and can be recycled locally, systems that communities could maintain without specialised contractors. This isn't a radical idea, it's already happening in some fields. Modular housing, prefabricated building systems, sustainable materials, but we could take it further, especially for infrastructure in disaster-prone areas. Second, the revival of communal labour for certain projects, not as mandatory corvée, but as voluntary community engagement. After natural disasters, we often see spontaneous outpourings of volunteer labour, people showing up with shovels, helping neighbours rebuild. What if we formalised this slightly? Not through coercion, but through social structures that made participation easy, meaningful, and rewarding. Community barn raisings used to be common in rural America. They've largely disappeared, but the human desire to help, to be part of something larger, still exists. Third, the integration of infrastructure maintenance into cultural rituals and education. Ancient peoples taught children about irrigation by having them participate in canal maintenance. They made festivals out of reconstruction projects. We've separated infrastructure management from daily life. It's invisible, handled by professionals until it breaks. What if we brought it back into visibility? School programs where students learned about local water systems by helping maintain them. Community events centered around infrastructure appreciation. This might sound absurdly idealistic. And maybe it is. But ancient peoples survived for millennia using these principles. We've only had industrial civilization for a few centuries. Who's to say our approach is superior? Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. The psychological resilience ancient peoples developed through their annual rebuilding cycles. Modern psychology recognizes that a sense of agency, the belief that you can influence your environment, is crucial for mental health. When disasters strike and people feel helpless, rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD skyrocket. But ancient peoples who rebuilt after floods didn't feel helpless. They felt competent. Yes, the flood was beyond their control, but the response to it was entirely within their control. They knew exactly what to do. They'd done it before. They'd do it again. This created a psychological framework that transformed disaster from trauma into routine. Not easy routine, not pleasant routine, but manageable routine. There's a concept in disaster psychology called resilience, the ability to bounce back from adversity. Ancient peoples were extraordinarily resilient, not because they were tougher than us in some inherent way, but because their social systems trained resilience through repeated experience. Every child who grew up in these societies watched their parents rebuild after floods. They learned that destruction was temporary, that community effort could restore order, that despair was unnecessary because recovery was inevitable. Compare that to modern experiences of disaster. When a hurricane destroys a neighbourhood today, recovery can take years. Insurance battles, contractor delays, bureaucratic hurdles. People feel powerless, waiting for external systems to solve their problems. Ancient peoples didn't wait. They acted, and that sense of agency, of collective efficacy, was psychologically protective. This isn't to say ancient life was easy or that we should envy it, but it does suggest that our modern approach, outsourcing recovery to professionals and institutions, comes with hidden psychological costs. When people lose the ability to directly respond to crisis, they lose something important, a sense of competence, of communal strength, of resilience. And this connects to a broader question about modern life. We've gained so much in comfort, safety, and convenience. But what have we lost? Ancient peoples lost their homes to floods every year, but they never lost the knowledge of how to rebuild them, the community bonds that made rebuilding possible, or the belief that they could endure. We've built infrastructure that rarely fails, but when it does, we're often paralysed, dependent on complex systems we don't understand and can't repair ourselves. There's something worth pondering in that trade-off. Let's examine a specific example to bring all of this into focus. The annual cycle of an Egyptian farming village along the Nile circa 2000 BCE. It's late spring. The fields are golden with grain ready for harvest. Every able-bodied person is working frantically. They know the flood is coming. They can feel it. The air changes. Certain birds appear. The priests have made their calculations. The inundation will arrive within weeks. The harvest is gathered, grain stored in elevated granaries built precisely for this purpose. Livestock are moved to higher ground. The village prepares. Then the water comes. Slowly at first, then faster. Fields disappear beneath muddy water. The river, normally a calm presence, becomes a vast lake. The village, built on a slight rise, becomes an island. For weeks, normal life stops. Fishing continues. Boats become the primary transportation, but field work is impossible. This is the time when the corvée labour begins. The local scribe arrives with his records. He consults with the village headman. This year their village owes 30 workers for 2 months to rebuild the irrigation canal that serves 3 villages downstream. Last year they worked on the canal that serves them. Next year they'll work on the northern dike. The workers are selected. Young men mostly, but some older workers with specialised skills. They gather their tools, simple things, hose, baskets, rope. The village provides them with extra rations for the journey. They walk to the worksite, meeting workers from other villages. The foreman, a man who's overseen this canal's reconstruction for a decade, organises them into teams. The work begins. The canal, scoured by the flood, must be redug. The gradient must be precise, calculated by experience and checked with simple levels. Too steep and the water rushes too fast, eroding the banks. Too shallow and it doesn't flow at all. They work in teams, some digging, some hauling the excavated earth, some shaping and compacting the banks. It's exhausting work under the brutal sun, but it's also social. They sing work songs, they joke. They compete to see which team can move more earth. Meals are communal. Large pots of lentil stew, bread, onions and beer. The rations are generous. The authorities understand that well-fed workers are productive workers. After a month, the canal is complete. An inspector arrives, checks the work, and marks the project as finished in his records. The workers return home, just as the floodwaters are beginning to recede. Back in the village, they find that several homes were damaged. The mud brick walls, softened by prolonged water exposure, have slumped. The work now shifts to rebuilding these homes. This is purely local. No scribes or foremen needed. Neighbours help neighbours. The damaged families are hosted by relatives while new bricks are made. Children help mix mud and straw. Women shape the bricks. Men lay them once they're dried. Within 2 weeks, the homes are rebuilt, stronger than before because the builders learned from last year's failures. They adjusted the mud mixture, changed the wall thickness, improved the foundation. The floodwaters recede fully, leaving behind a thick layer of rich silt. The fields, renewed, are ready for planting. The irrigation canal, freshly rebuilt, will deliver water precisely where it's needed. The cycle begins again. Plant, grow, harvest, flood, rebuild, year after year, generation after generation for thousands of years. This is what ancient life looked like. Not easy, not comfortable, but sustainable, communal, resilient. Before we conclude, let's return to the question we started with. Why was rebuilding easier than replacing? We've explored the practical reasons: locally available materials, distributed knowledge, organised labour systems, predictable cycles. But there's a deeper answer. Rebuilding was easier because it was woven into the fabric of society. It wasn't an emergency response. It was a scheduled routine. It wasn't a burden imposed from outside. It was a shared responsibility everyone understood. Replacing would have meant something fundamentally different. It would have meant abandoning the old systems, the old knowledge, the old social structures. It would have meant starting over, and starting over is always harder than continuing. Modern societies face a different challenge. Our infrastructure is so complex, so specialised, that when it fails, we can't rebuild it. We can only replace it at enormous cost, with enormous disruption. And because we've lost the social structures that organise communal labour, we can't even imagine mobilising our communities the way ancient peoples did. We've traded resilience for efficiency. We've traded community for individualism. We've traded distributed knowledge for specialised expertise. These aren't necessarily bad trades. Modern life offers comforts and opportunities ancient peoples couldn't dream of. But they are trades, and trades always involve losses as well as gains. So as we face our own infrastructure challenges, climate change, ageing systems, resource constraints, perhaps we can learn something from the ancient peoples who rebuilt their worlds every single year. Not the specific techniques. We're not going back to mud bricks, but the principles. Design for replaceability. Distribute knowledge widely. Build social structures that encourage collective action. Create meaning around maintenance and rebuilding. And most importantly, remember that infrastructure isn't just physical, it's social. The ancient peoples understood that the canal wasn't just a ditch. It was the manifestation of communal cooperation. The wall wasn't just mud bricks. It was the crystallised effort of neighbours helping neighbours. When the flood washed away the physical structures, it didn't wash away the knowledge, the relationships, or the will to rebuild. Those remained, embedded in the community, ready to be activated. That's why rebuilding was easier than replacing. Because what they were rebuilding wasn't just infrastructure, it was community itself. And community, unlike canals, doesn't need to be dug anew each year. It just needs to be maintained, nurtured, and called upon when needed. The ancient peoples knew this. Somewhere along the way, we forgot. But the lessons are still there, buried like archaeological treasures, waiting to be rediscovered. In the mud bricks of Egypt, in the reed houses of Mesopotamia, in the perfectly graded canals that ran for hundreds of miles, there's a message. Resilience isn't built in materials, it's built in people. And when people work together, when they share knowledge, when they believe in a common purpose, they can rebuild anything, even after the waters rise.